What is it exactly that runs modern life, so to speak? It's not your leader, not your boss, not your president, king, or even prime minister. Rather, it's a process. It's a new kind of ruler which has emerged. Impersonal, faceless, and untouchable. We live in a world where the most powerful decisions are made in meetings that you'll never hear about, by committees with no faces and under rules which no one voted for. This is not a conspiracy, but rather a system, a new kind of regime, one that doesn't believe in loyalty, love, nation, or even profit. It believes in management. This is the Inorganic Society. The first concept, which is necessary to explain this new society, is the idea of power without sovereigns. This arrangement consists of a new managerial elite slowly taking control from individual ownership of economic, social, and political affairs, not an aristocracy or an oligarchy, but rather a system. Originally, individual ownership and control of enterprises has now been mostly wiped from the economy, with the rise of large-scale transnational corporations, as well as the increasing size of the bureaucracy of the state. It's really a large-scale organization that manages most of how we live, what we deal with, how we interact with people, what we eat, the clothes we wear, the jobs and work that we mostly do, and increasingly so with every year. As the managers have become more specialized and crucial to the methods of production, as they become more large-scale, they become more so a separate class, with the burghers, which is what I call the capital-holding merchants or leaders of commerce, businessmen, have been increasingly withdrawn from management. Power has thus been shifting from the burghers to the managers, as the managers have an increasing control over society. They've been able to amalgamate more and more power for their own class, as the burghers have themselves been losing their status. And this is the same process which happened with the transition from aristocracy to the merchant class in the Middle Ages to the early modern period. But now the merchants are themselves losing power as the managers rise. All of this has led to a system itself becoming more in control than any person or group of people. And this feeds into the next concept that I'd like to call the lack of narrative, or telos, where people feel managed and not led. We're not led as a nation, a religion, a sub-region, a people, even a province. Rather, many people increasingly feel that they live in an economic unit. So this sets up the term inorganic. It's, in essence, a society which no longer grows from cultural soil, but is assembled by committees. Another process that is part of this overarching concept is the over-socialization and breakdown in human relations. This has been growing to some extent since the rise of the Industrial Revolution, and exponentially with social technologies such as the television, automobile, smartphone, overall essentially being separated from people more so by technology with every passing year. Really, this is no news to anyone today. But it's something which I think the overall reasons behind it and its full effects on society are not fully appreciated today. This relates to another concept of the end cycle of Western civilization by Spengler. So another idea which I think is very prescient to connect here and fundamental to understanding the inorganic society is that rather than on being a path of linear growth, humanity always growing with every single century, and every year being better, or at least every century being better than the one before it. Our increasing decline of human social relations and feelings of atomization are well explained by the cyclical explanation of human civilization, with Oswald Spengler's The Decline of the West providing not only an explanation for the fall of our society, but an overview of how all civilizations rise and fall among similar mechanisms, seeing entire civilizations as, in essence, a single organic entity. This is apparent in art, mathematics, architecture, and so many different forms and patterns of a civilization. But in essence, just as we have pop culture, just as our art forms have been degrading to some extent, the same process has been gone over in Chinese civilization, Greco-Roman civilization, Indian civilization, and many others. And this is simply us being in the point where we are in our civilizational cycle, rather than being explained by who we are alone. Now in the winter stage of our civilization, and there's an increasing focus on material comforts with strained human relations. This is not only explained by the Industrial Revolution, but the Industrial Revolution itself, along with capitalism, socialism, even managerialism, are all explained both by the point of where we are in our civilizational cycle, and as well as the unique nature and soul of Western man, what Spengler calls Faustian man, the one who has the aspiration for unreachable, unlimited power and truth. This helps to explain why our society seems to be crumbling, or at least ossified to some extent. It doesn't really feel as natural or dynamic as it did before. Another main concept is social atomization, which has been increasingly apparent by almost anyone you would ask on the street, as the more social conformist and lonely character of the individual has emerged essentially for the past 50 to 100 years from Western society. It's essentially individualism being taken further and further, which has transformed from a social good into something much worse than even a weakness. The individual himself has lost his inner drive, with conformism and other direction, explained by David Riesman's The Lonely Crowd, becoming more dominant, springing up from the upper middle classes in the West to now being the dominant social ideal or organizational drive today. Inner direction for achievement and for social approval is increasingly replaced by other direction, as in the orientation towards groupthink. It's this change that allows trends ranging from fashion to morality to change ever more quickly and to have an ever stronger hold with every passing decade.
What is your motto here? Boys, inform on your classmates, save your hide. Anything short of that, we're gonna burn you at the stake? Well, gentlemen, when the shit hits the fan, some guys run and some guys stay. Here's Charlie facing the fire, and there's George hiding in Big Daddy's pocket. And what are you doing? You're gonna reward George and destroy Charlie.
Are you finished, Mr. Slade?
No, I'm just getting warmed up. I don't know who went to this place. William Howard Taft, William Jennings Bryan, William Tell, whoever. Their spirit is dead, if they ever had one. It's gone. You're building a rat ship here. A vessel for seagoing snitches. And if you think you're preparing these minnows for manhood, you better think again. Because I say you are killing the very spirit this institution proclaims it instills.
Most civilizations are born in blood and belief. They arise with stories, songs, rituals. The rulers are priests, kings, or warriors. But in our case, especially after World War II, something strange happened. Our institutions didn't exactly collapse, they became automated. So post-World War II, society began to march increasingly down the path of progress, as we have increasingly begun to see a decline in values. With every single decade, we now seem to be coming to a point where we scratch our heads and look around, since officially on paper we're increasing in comforts and luxury with every year, but there's something not exactly right. And economic inequality is part of that, but it's just one part in an overall equation. So the 5 features of the Inorganic Society that define us, who we are today, how we live, and how we're almost forced to live, is as follows. The first is rule by function. Power flows through bureaucracies and forms, not from a person, but from a role. As a shift from individual capitalist control to collective managerial governance has happened, we've increasingly overall felt more managed as a society. And this expands from just an economic idea to an overall idea. So from an ownership-based role to a position-based role, with managers and bureaucrats taking charge, accountability is now diffused. You can't outvote a compliance department. You can't really argue with the policy. The system just says that's the process. Decisions themselves come from protocol now, not judgment. There's no room for personal ethics or even statesmanship. It's just adherence to a structure. Policies themselves outlive leadership. I mean, this is very clear with the President of the United States not having full control over his or her policy from year to year. I mean, as much as Biden or Trump want to direct their own function, and it does seem like that to an extent, they don't have full ownership of their own office. It's really the bureaucracy that runs everything, even though it doesn't seem that way. And just as the top level of society is oriented that way, I would argue that all of our society, even to the bottom, is oriented in almost the exact same way, where there's no accountability and ownership in society itself.
If it's our job to carry out government policies, shouldn't we believe in them?
What an extraordinary idea.
Why?
Bernard, I have served 11 governments in the past 30 years. If I'd believed in all their policies, I would have been passionately committed to keeping out of the common market and passionately committed to going into it. I would have been utterly convinced of the rightness of nationalizing steel and of denationalizing it and renationalizing it. In capital punishment, I'd have been a fervent retentionist and an ardent abolitionist. I would have been a Keynesian and a Friedmanite, a grammar school preserver and destroyer, a nationalization freak and a privatization maniac, but above all, I would have been a stark-staring, raving schizophrenic.
So what do we believe in?
At this moment, Bernard, we believe in stopping the minister from informing the prime minister.
The second feature is the loss of cultural root. Now our values are not taught, they're managed. Rituals don't evolve, they're issued as policy updates. So, with the effects of industrialization and globalization, and urbanization even, they express themselves in different ways, with the loss of cultural values, declining birth rates, nihilism, as well as specific ideas such as the red pill movement, third wave feminism, all stemming down from an increasing inorganic society in different ways to cope with living in a more atomized world, where we don't really feel connected with our wider family, community. Instead, we kind of live in some massive beehive with no understanding of what's around us. The third concept is the endless growth of process. Every year, more HR policies, more compliance systems, more protocols are implemented. In a time of consumption rather than production, population stagnation and decline rather than growth, of luxury and decadence rather than productivity, has changed the way society itself even acts and is oriented. In the US, in a governance perspective, the legislature itself is losing power to executive institutions every year. Lawyers already know this to be the case, and in order to keep up with contemporary law, they study the rulings and records of these agencies, the NLRB, the SEC, the ICC, etc., chiefly with overall enormous growth of the executive government driving this, with the crown is what I call the executive government of the US, but in other countries, it's either the prime ministership or only in a few traditional monarchies does the crown actually mean the crown. But in most countries, the crown is becoming more so not a single entity, but an overall process and managerial bureaucratic mass that really doesn't really decrease or go down in size with any year passing. It just eats up more and more at this point for the sake of its own growth. The finance capitalists, which are still technically in control, but are in the process of losing control over society, are somewhat, as I've said before, like the feudal lords of the Middle Ages. They see their own system deteriorating, but they really fail to put any solution, even to their own benefit, to stop it or contest the power of their opponents, which is in this case the managers. Our growth and energy is increasingly placed in these institutions of bureaucracy and commerce, which really don't produce anything tangible more so with every passing year. The economy becomes growth for the sake of growth, rather than being for the benefit of mankind or for a specific country. The economy itself becomes more so redistributed symbolic value. People living in it being justified by their own role in maintaining the system, rather than a more concrete sense of living off of something tangibly produced. The fourth concept I'd want to discuss is the substitution of form for meaning. A society where ethics are replaced by branding guidelines, where church becomes a seminar, and where tradition becomes a slogan, is apparently not an organic or even a well-functioning society. And at this point, it's obvious to most people that something is wrong, but most people can't exactly put their finger on what. In today's world, the rituals of days gone by actually remain. It's just their substance that's gone. What once held sacred or communal meaning is now replaced with performative gestures, bureaucratic scripts, and aesthetic formalities. Institutions retain their shape, but not their spirit. This can be seen. One interesting example, which is probably not well known to most people, is that in highly formal high church rituals remaining popular in more secular areas of the US, such as New England, the rituals themselves are quite important and are held to quite decidedly. However, the actual belief, the passion of belief in Christianity in those churches has died down to it more so being a social club at this point, with the strict formal rituals being in their place still. Holidays in the US at this point are more so for marketing consumer items or simply having a break from work, rather than the actual purpose of having the holiday itself. At this point, even ethics are outsourced. Where people once derived morality from virtue, duty, or divine law, we now get ethics in the form of HR handbooks or mission statements. This is not only described in the managerial revolution, rather in Oswald Spengler's The Decline of the West. This concept is explained as form outliving meaning. So really what this is part of an overall process that happens to every society, where it gets to a certain point where form simply outlives the meaning that originally it had. Rituals become mechanical, religion becomes ethics, and ethics become compliance. Burnham, for his part, described that in the managerial society, meaning is subordinated to legibility and administration, not truth or virtue, but just manageability. As I would say, the Inorganic Society doesn't destroy meaning, it embalms it. The last concept I'd wanted to describe that really grounds this whole idea together is invisibility of power. The modern system we deal with has no face. It cannot be hated, loved, or overthrown. It's everywhere and nowhere. Power is no longer embodied. It's dispersed. You can't storm the castle if the king is a network of departments, guidelines, and representatives. No single actor is responsible, but every action is justified. It's policy. It's the algorithm. It's someone doing his job. Control operates through systems and not symbols. There's no throne, just interfaces. There's no tyrant, just terms and conditions. Opposition with this becomes, or at least is seemingly, meaningless. You can't rebel against a spreadsheet. There's no ideology to refute, no speech to protest. We may have at this point what people describe as wokeness or the counter-conservative backlash. However, at its core, the way society is structured, there really isn't a core ideology that people, for the large part, are grounded by. It's more so ethics being turned into compliance, with religion having dissipated to some extent long before, decades, even a century ago. Burnham helps us to name the shift, but still, it doesn't fully encapsulate the scale or weirdness of what we live with today. Managers don't own anything. They simply administer. They're unseen, unelected. Their power lies in procedure, not charisma. At this point, 50% of most modern economies, including the US, rely on the state, and the state relies on managers. And even outside of that, corporations itself simply consists of managers. You have to understand that the manager is not a capitalist. The capitalist once owned a firm and directed its value, whether for greed, virtue, or vanity. The manager doesn't own anything. He doesn't believe and he doesn't lead. He merely administers. His loyalty is to function, targets, and the process itself, not to any metaphysical or moral order. In managerialism, power equals access to systems, information, and institutional levers. This is the first ruling class in history which has now been divorced from ownership and identity. As such, power is now modular and masked. Managers multiply through scale. HR, compliance, ESG officers, diversity consultants, regional directors, bureaucrats. The larger the system, the more managers become the internal gravity. The manager class has no icon. It rules through flowcharts, not flags. Think tanks write policy. Bureaucrats issue regulations. Administrators execute, but no one actually takes responsibility. What was once ruled by law or ruled by king is now ruled by spreadsheet.
And please, speak as you might to a young child or a golden retriever. It wasn't brains that got me here, I can assure you of that.
What happens to the human soul in a state like this? I've described before how it shifts from inner-directed to an other-directed personality, where morals and identity are derived from social feedback loops. In The Lonely Crowd, Riesman describes a shift in the American character, from inner-directed, guided by an internalized moral compass, to other-directed, constantly having to adapt to peers, trends, and mass media. The other-directed type is the ideal subject of managerial rule. He is cooperative, anxious, and shaped by feedback, not virtue. He doesn't ask what's right, he asks what is acceptable. And in a society governed by shifting protocols, acceptability becomes the only morality. Oswald Spengler described that in late civilizations, we arrive to a point where the megalopolis, an atomized mass, becomes the defining feature of a civilization. Today, cities such as New York, or not even New York, but rather the megalopolis, stretching from Boston all the way to DC, with miles and miles of urban jungle extending deep, deep into the countryside, really allows for a different kind of society. In the megalopolis, man becomes detached from blood, land, and tradition. Social life becomes more artificial and fragmented, filled with strangers and screens. Religion becomes psychology, community becomes network, and art becomes content. The megalopolis is not a city. It's a machine that harvests attention and excretes isolation. The individual becomes a node in systems of commerce, communication, and control, but he no longer is a bearer of the cultural memory or metaphysical identity of his previous generations. This is well understood for all of history, where in most large cities, over all of history, in all types of civilizations, it simply could not replace the amount of people it had with a birth rate. Anytime people move into a city, the birth rates collapse, and it needs to constantly bring in more people from the countryside to sustain itself, since humans are simply not evolved to live in such a large-scale, complex, and claustrophobic environment, not just physically, but also socially and mentally. In this kind of society, people don't rebel, they mimic rebellion. What we call subversion is a performance pre-approved by the algorithm. Even rebellion itself is branded, hashtagged, and monetized. The soul itself more so becomes a signal. Without the sacred structures of family, myth, liturgy, and land, people imitate systems because these systems are the only thing that's left. All of this creates a rather strange psychological landscape with mass anxiety, chronic indecision, and the hollowing out of meaning from emotion itself. People don't feel what's true, they feel what's expected. Now, in our current day, people simply exist. Connected to their local communities becomes rather people disconnected, existing in procedural drift. As the form outlives the spirit, mass society outlives the culture from which it grew from, which is the fundamental aspect of where we are today. In the winter phase of civilization, man becomes increasingly atomized in society. The urban, discrete culture spreads beyond the megalopolis, as community and bonds become increasingly fragile and watered down. This is affected more so as Faustian civilization is not only in its winter state, but that our version of it, with industrialization, introduces a particular deep-seated anti-humanistic aspect, with information technology seeping its way into the human consciousness ever more so, as we become less integrated parts of a human network and more part of a digital network. Mass media itself, as one example, with the collapse of authenticity as well as the collapse of authentic living, leads into branded rebellion, algorithmic outrage, and prepackaged resistance. People for the most part are herded more and more so with every year by the system around them, the state, companies, systems of living that all envelops them in general, and less with their wild, more independent ancestors, even from a few generations ago. At this point, we are more so becoming zoo animals, caged in and less in touch with the drives of our genuine connection and freedom. There's a collective feeling of anxiety and inertia that can be felt but not fully seen. The result of all of this is mass psychological instability. We're now easily controlled as individuals in the state, but increasingly there's no one at the wheel. No one is even pulling the puppet strings. Society simply has become this automated system, with no one driving it forward anymore. Machines don't have souls. Societies do. And when the machine becomes the society, the collapse begins not with fire, but with forgetting. As Spengler explained, every civilization begins to die when form replaces force. This is apparent at large, but even when you zoom in rather interesting ways, we can see it express itself. Parliaments, Congress, different summits debate endlessly, but don't really produce as much transformative content. Legislation is increasingly more and more so transformed into ritual. National holidays, as I've said before, and cultural traditions are repackaged and reduced to sales events. Instagram content. Force is what I would define the creativity and formative energy of a civilization. Its myths, its will, its faith, art, architecture, statesmanship, exploration, expansion. It's not exactly something you can touch, but it's always there. Form is the mechanical survival of these things after the will is gone. Institutions, ceremonies, the rules themselves persist, but only as empty shelves. In the winter of a civilization's life cycle, the living drive is replaced by habit, bureaucracy, and preservation of appearances. This is most visible in the Megalopolis, huge, rootless population centers that perpetuate systems without even renewing them. Bureaucracy and ritual survive long after the soul has fled. The civilization has been set on an autopilot of sorts that continues to function even as the inner characteristics of a civilization are taken further and further to their utmost extent, where a once good trait becomes its undoing. With Western civilization, it's our obsession with commerce and machinery. This has been increasingly taken to its fullest extent, where we now live in the Inorganic Society.
You are an old man who thinks in terms of nations and peoples. There are no nations. There are no peoples. There are no Russians. There are no Arabs. There are no third worlds. There is no West. There is only one holistic system of systems. One vast and immane, interwoven, interacting, multivariate, multinational dominion of dollars. Petrodollars, electrodollars, multi-dollars, Reichmarks, rims, rubles, pounds, and shekels. It is the international system of currency which determines the totality of life on this planet. That is the natural order of things today. That is the atomic and subatomic and galactic structure of things today. and you have meddled with the primal forces of nature. And you will atone. Am I getting through to you, Mr. Beale? You get up on your little 21-inch screen and howl about America and democracy. There is no America. There is no democracy. There is only IBM and ITT and AT&T and DuPont, Dow, Union Carbide, and Exxon. Those are the nations of the world today. What do you think the Russians talk about in their councils of state? Karl Marx? They get out their linear programming charts, statistical decision theories, Minimax solutions, and compute the price-cost probabilities of their transactions and investments, just like we do. We no longer live in a world of nations and ideologies, Mr. Beale. The world is a college of corporations, inexorably determined by the immutable bylaws of business.
As the inner spirit and drive of our civilization runs out, the forms keep running as the inner traits developed early on in the springtime childhood of our society over 1,000 years ago, the drive towards commerce, exploration, and machinery are taken further from being our strength to our demise. With this, our society cannot even socialize properly without this inner force, and the economic and managerial functions of society become more brittle, strained, and dare I say, inorganic, with every passing year. But when that form can no longer sustain itself, something older returns, something Caesaric. Caesarism comes when all of a society consciously and unconsciously demands a centralizing figure to take control, as the machinery and trust that manage society itself to be able to function and to be governed cease to work anymore, as wealth, inequality, lack of social trust, depravity, lack of morals, all get worse and worse in an interconnected complex web that begins to crumble under its own weight. This is the future that we look forward to.